Well, actually, it's not subjective. It's that the companies don't want to follow the objective way to safety.
Got it.
If they'd followed ISO 26262 and ISO 21448 and ANSI UL 4600, they could be objectively safe by conforming to industry safety standards. But if they don't, then they're
Hmm.
using engineering judgment, and I have no idea how it's going to turn out. We're going to have to
Yeah.
see. The question is going to be, sure, they can run a handful of cars for a few days and claim
Yeah.
victory. And even if they're 10x more dangerous than a human driver, with 10 cars for a couple days, probably
Nothing
nothing will
should
happen anyway.
happen. Professor Philip Koopman of Carnegie Mellon University is an internationally recognized expert on autonomous vehicle safety whose work in that area spans almost 30 years. He has also worked extensively in more general embedded system design, software quality, and safety across numerous transportation, industrial, and defense application domains, including conventional automotive, software, and hardware systems. Phil also hosts the Substack newsletter Autonomous System Safety, where he breaks down complex safety topics for engineers, regulators, and autonomous vehicle stakeholders. And I guess I should throw in myself because I'm also a subscriber, a happy one at that. So, Phil, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Harry.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat with you. And I think actually the first time I reached out to you, I was wondering what you're up to all day, because I feel like you are a prolific writer, and I sort of knew you best from your LinkedIn posts and your Substack. But I read off your more formal bio. But tell me, what does your sort of day to day and week to week look like in the world of AV these days?
Well, until the day we're recording it, I've been a professor at Carnegie Mellon for, those 30 years.
Yeah.
But I'm retiring July 1st.
Oh,
And
wow.
so you're going to notice I'm less prolific on LinkedIn, and my
Okay.
Substack has gone down to less often because I'm sort of phasing out of the professor gig and slowing down a little, taking a little more time for myself, and still doing plenty of consulting work. So you'll still see the posts, but I'm not going to be on top of, if there's an article and I have nothing to add, I'm just going to let
Got
it
it.
go. Maybe repost it without comment. So I'm in the middle of transitioning out of the professor gig and into maybe a soft retirement is the way to look at it.
Okay, interesting. What was the impetus for starting all of the writing work and all of the posts that you do on LinkedIn around AV safety?
I've been doing safety for 30 years, right?
Hmm.
And what's happened is the robotaxi and now robotruck industry have matured to the point that this has become a mainstream topic. And
Got
so
it.
most of my posts are there to educate. I mean, I have my
Mm.
opinions. I'm happy to tell people my opinions, but my primary goal is to provide education.
Mm.
And sometimes when the industry is pushing really hard on something that is pushing the boundaries of fair and balanced or
Yeah.
truth or propaganda or whatever you want to call it, right? Sometimes I concentrate on the other side of the story because it needs to be told, and there's billions of dollars pushing the one side of the story, and
Yeah.
there's a couple scrappy independent authors not getting paid for it pushing
Yeah.
the other. So I spend more time on the let's think about safety, let's be a little cautious, yeah, there's some pros, but there's also some cons. The cons need to
Yeah.
be discussed. I spend more time on that just as a matter of there are very few voices doing it. Someone's got to play
Hmm.
that role. And since I have the background, I have the expertise, and I like to write, that's sort of where I end up.
Yeah, you mentioned educate, and I think you said the word inform. It kind of reminded me of more of a journalist. Like when I look at the coverage that I've done of the rideshare industry, I'm
Yeah.
pretty quick to tell people I'm not a journalist. I cover the industry. I write from experience. I work with a lot of companies, though, so I have lots of conflicts of interest. How do you
Yeah.
think about yourself in kind of that landscape of coverage? How do you think like academia fits in? Maybe even compare it to a journalist, for example.
So for sure, I'm not a journalist. I know some real journalists, and I respect them greatly. They have a somewhat different mission than I have. So I'm allowed to take sides. I'm allowed to
Hmm.
express my opinion, but I try and do it in a really rigorous way. So I'm not required to do both sides thing, right?
Yeah.
That's not in my charter. I'm allowed and encouraged to express my opinion, but I try and do it in a way that is really backed up. I guess they call it these days calling it having the receipts, right?
Hmm.
So most of what I write, I got the receipts,
Got it.
and other people are making the other points, so I don't feel obliged to spend half my time making the pro points if I'm arguing con today. But if I'm arguing con, then it's not just me waving my hands,
Yeah.
point A, point B, point C, and no one else is talking about it, so I'm going to talk about it. And sometimes I say pro. There are good things the industry does, and there are some problematic things the industry does, but I try and do the things that have to do with safety And safety is very often about, well, that's really cool, but what about one of my social media hashtags that I used to use more is, did you think about did you think about it, right?
Yeah.
Did
Well,
you think
would
of
you
that? Did you think of that? Sorry, did you think of that? Did you think of this?
gotcha?
Did you think of this? Did you think of this?
And how would you describe your overall outlook on the AV industry and sort of all the, I mean, companies? I think I know what you'll answer, but I'm curious.
It's the big picture is really interesting because I've been at it 3 decades now.
Yeah.
And back then, the way I got involved, the origin story is Carnegie Mellon had a car that went from Washington to San Diego, 98% hands off the wheel.
Oh,
And
cool.
as the alums of that group like to say, and everyone's been working on that last 2% for 30
For 30
years.
years?
And it was basically a lane keeping system. But 30 years ago, that was and it was
Yeah.
camera only lane keeping. That's pretty
Wow.
darn impressive, right?
Yeah.
And in that's been a 30-year journey, right? This is well before the Grand Challenge. Okay, and other groups have been working on the technology at least that long. Berkeley had a system that followed magnets in the road. There were a bunch of folks in the 90s, and I got brought into the CMU team because they started saying, well, now that the technology kind of sort of works, let's talk about safety, right?
Yeah.
That's going to matter too. And there's a lot of euphoria about, hey, we have robotaxis in multiple cities, which is just amazing. That's astonishing. 30 years ago, we were like, yeah, that's not happening anytime soon, but it's happening, and the
Yeah.
technology's
Well, I guess it
improving.
took a while from 30 years ago.
Well, it took 30 years, and
Yeah,
we're
it
like,
took
it's not
30
happening
years.
soon. And so there was a hiatus for like 10 years, and then the Grand Challenge came out. And even then,
Yeah.
in 2005, it's still been 20 years, right? So it's taken a long time. But the telling the other side of the story, sure, it's exciting, it's amazing stuff, but very limited areas, a lot of cars, and 1,000 cars, but that's not a million cars,
Yeah.
much less 100 million cars, right? So rare events are less rare, but they're still rare. Whereas
Yeah.
with a million or 100 million cars, rare stuff happens literally every day, every hour, every minute. So the thing to keep in mind is getting from 1,000 cars to a million cars could easily take just as long.
Hmm. And why is that?
There's a social acceptance issue we can
Hmm.
come back to, but I'll talk about the technical issue. The technical issue is that the underlying technology is machine learning. In machine learning, you give it a bunch of examples, and learning is sort of not quite what's going on. It pulls out some statistical data.
Hmm.
And so when you showed a picture of a pedestrian, it doesn't know that it's a pedestrian. It knows that it looks like all the other pedestrians it's seen, and therefore it must be a pedestrian.
Got it.
That distinction matters because statistics are good for stuff it's seen and really, really bad at stuff it's never seen before.
Hmm.
So it's basically just guessing. So what does that mean? Statistical stuff works great on the stuff you see all the time,
Hmm.
and it struggles and is notorious for false confidence and just doing stuff that lacks common sense. If a person, you'd say that person has no common sense because
Yeah.
it's just guessing. When it sees something rare, well, what does safety do? If you can't drive down the road without hitting something in a mile, most people wouldn't call that safety. They call that, it doesn't know how to drive, right? That's
Yeah.
not a safety problem. That's a you don't know how to drive problem, right? And at some point, when you get to 100 miles, 1,000 miles, 10,000 miles, 100,000 miles without hitting stuff, now you're getting the safety.
Hmm.
But safety lives out at the 100 million mile, which is literally
Mm.
beyond the human experience. Who drives 100 million miles, right? But
Gotcha.
fatalities are one fatality per 85 to 100 million miles in the U.S. So, and that includes all the drunks, by the way.
Hmm.
Humans are actually really impressively good drivers. We wish they were better, but they're impressively good. And statistics has trouble with a 1 per 100 million kind of thing.
Yeah.
Statistics really struggles, and there'll be rare things, not necessarily weird,
Are you
just,
saying that you really have to do a lot of rides? You have to have a lot of cars out there before you
well,
start seeing some of these 1 in 100 million
you
situations?
need 1 billion miles. You might need 10 billion miles.
Yeah.
And even then, depending on the distribution, you probably haven't seen everything. So how does your car know to deal with stuff it's never seen? Now, it doesn't have to keep driving, but people are remarkably good at, what the heck is that? I don't know what's going on.
Hmm.
I'm going to slow down until I figure it out. And machine learning is notoriously bad at that.
Got it.
So
So we
that's the
must
technical
do
challenge.
So I know the stat that is often recited that 40,000 plus people die every year in the US due to
because
automobile deaths.
there's that many
Well,
miles.
so that's sort of what I was thinking.
It's
Wow, we must
trillions
do
of
a
miles.
lot.
It's
We must
trillions of
do a
miles,
lot of
right?
driving here in the
Yeah,
US. All right, that was
that's right.
totally off tangent,
No,
but
no, but no, that's actually good because people say that's that many deaths. This must be sort of really dangerous.
yeah,
And the answer is no, there's that many miles. I mean,
yeah,
I would certainly, other countries do better than us. In
yes,
Europe, many countries do way better than we do. But even as lagging behind the pack as the US is,
hmm,
one fatality per 100 million miles is that's a
yeah,
lot of miles. I'm trying to build a computer that can do 100 million anything without making a mistake. That's
yeah.
really hard.
Well, so let's talk about Waymo. I think they were
Okay.
sort of the real inflection point over the past year for me, launching in LA and San Francisco and being able to take the rides for customers. I think it's very cool for you,
Mhm.
kind of having this come full circle in your career. I'm looking at them right now. It looks like they've done over 33 million autonomous miles.
They're up to
And
75 million. Last I heard, they were at 75 million. That
okay.
just came out this week. Yeah.
Oh,
I
okay.
may
All
not
right.
get
So
that number
they're
right, but that's the number I recall.
all right. They're in the
Gotta
tens of
give them credit. Give
millions.
them credit where credit is due. Yep.
What are your thoughts on Waymo's safety record so far?
It's a tale of two stories.
Hmm.
I almost said cities, but tale of two stories. You have the research group, which is studying the outcomes, and they're trying to be rigorous. Their rigor has improved over time. They've gotten
Hmm.
more careful, they got more thorough, and that's to be commended. But the last paper of theirs that I've seen, I haven't read the ones from this week or from yesterday or
Yeah.
whatever it was, but the last papers I've seen made it clear we don't have enough data to know how fatalities are going to turn out.
Hmm.
We have pretty good data on injury crashes at this point, but we don't know about
So
fatalities.
this would be the Swiss RE study that was released in December of 2024. Does that sound
Probably
about
that
right?
one. They and
And
they
it
say that
looks, I
for a
have it
reason.
pulled up right here. It looks like, I mean, this is according to their study. Okay, 88% reduction in property damage claims, 92% reduction in bodily injury claims, and in real numbers across 25.3 million miles, just nine property damage claims and two bodily injury claims. So sounds
So I
good, right?
sounds good. Let me give you a couple of things in it though.
All right,
Now,
caveats.
I have not read that one in detail. I'm letting
Okay.
other people do it as part of my shift in retirement. Nobody's paying me to read all these papers and do the dissection. But insurance claims, the way they define claim is they had to pay out to someone else. So
Got it.
it's not all the injuries, it's not all the property damage, right?
Okay.
And they will probably
But if
argue, well,
Waymo is at fault, then they would
well,
obviously that
it's
would be their
basically
claim,
the
right?
question is, are they at fault, or is
Yeah.
there some middle ground where they pay even though there's no fault? It gets really complicated
Got
in a
it.
hurry.
Okay.
Okay, but it's not all the crashes; it's just some of the
Hmm.
crashes. So they will say, do this one say there's no single vehicle crashes? It probably says that last I checked.
I'm not sure about that.
Okay, but a Waymo crashed into a telephone pole, but there was no passenger. Oh no, there's no, it crashed into a telephone pole, but there was no
Hmm.
passenger. And
Gotcha.
some of the statistics don't count that one because there was no passenger or
Okay.
because there was no payout to a third party or. And so when you read these statistics, you have to ask hard questions about what's really in, what's really out. Okay.
Got it.
But
That's fair.
I don't, the report is what it is. Anytime
Hmm.
you report from any of these companies, you have to ask, well, what's in and what's out, and what's the claim really mean?
Yeah.
But the
Well, and I
bigger
think there's
issue,
definitely, I've been covering Uber and Lyft for
yeah,
11 years, so I'm no stranger to the company reports that they do. I mean,
well,
how many reports have ever been done, that weren't released, right?
yeah,
So
well,
I
yeah, yeah. I mean, there's that, but this is from their research group as opposed to the
mhm.
public relations group.
Got
But
it.
what we will find in any Waymo report I've read, I didn't read the one this week, is
Hmm.
somewhere in there, and I think it's in this report. If you look down in the fine print in the back, it'll say there's not enough data to know about fatalities.
Hmm. Okay.
And that's true because if it's 100 million miles per fatality in round numbers, and you've gone 50 million miles, you don't know how it's going to turn out. How could
Got
you
it.
possibly know how it's going to turn out, right?
Well, I think that's kind of always been the big thing that stood out to me with Waymo. And I think you've commented on this in the past
Yeah.
and more broadly that, well, one, there haven't been any deaths to my knowledge. No one
But
has.
it's
Uh,
but it's still the early innings, and
right,
that's the point.
exactly. So
It's
no
still
one's
the early
died in a
innings.
Waymo, which is a
I
good thing.
should.
And I think
My
you've
answer is I
said,
should hope that hasn't happened because it's
yeah,
too early, right?
I think you've said if someone has, that's really bad. I can't remember how
That'd
you
be really
phrase it, but I
bad.
think you said that's really
Well,
bad, right? That if
if
someone
someone
has,
if someone had died in the first 10 million miles, that would be super bad because
yeah,
it wasn't time yet. And I
because it was
understand
supposed to be 1 in 100 million, and obviously, then if it was just a fluke and over the next 90 million, but
yeah,
you
you
would be
can get
worried, right?
unlucky. You
Yeah,
can get
if it happened in
unlucky.
that first 50, I would say you'd be worried.
You should be worried and be very careful going forward because
Hmm.
it's easier to believe there's a safety problem than not. Now, they're getting to the point, they have enough miles that maybe they're getting to the point, but I think you need something like 300 million to have 95% confidence that it's no
Got it.
worse than a human driver. So they're getting down the road and things are going well. If they were to say, we're on track, we think we're safe as a human driver and we're on track with that with the data, I would say, okay,
Hmm.
I can argue with that.
Yeah.
But if you look at the public relations folks, they've been saying for years they're already saving lives. And that's just not true. Their own research says we don't know, but they're saying, yep, we're taking credit for saving lives. And so I
Yeah,
said tale of two
well,
cities, and that's the two
the
cities.
you know what, Phil, the saving lives, I'm a bit skeptical of that claim in
Yep,
general. And that's like a whole nother can of worms we won't get into. But
yep.
the whole point of AVs is to be cheaper. And, actually when rides are cheaper, it's going to induce a lot more demand. And so, that kind of, right, if you have the baseline of all of these existing rides, 40,000 people, and Waymo's adding a bunch on top of it, actually mathematically there will be, more
Well,
deaths, right? Unless it's replacing existing trips, which is like a whole, another can of
well,
worms,
so
basically.
let's go there in two different ways. One is if it is fewer fatalities per mile than a human driver, and which human driver where and all that other stuff. But
Yeah.
Waymo's gotten better at doing those comparisons, so that's fine.
Yeah.
If it's fewer fatalities per mile, that's a win, assuming all things are constant, which they aren't.
Right.
And the interesting idea that I've heard that goes down that path is if ride hail is pulling passengers away from mass transit is dramatically safer
Yeah, that's true.
than a human driven vehicle. And so you could see a net increase in fatalities per mile or fatalities per trip, take your pick. You could say a net increase in fatalities because riders are being pulled out of mass transit into robotaxis. And there are some cities where you just can't do it because there isn't the road space. But most cities you could put more cars on the road without bringing the city to
Yeah.
a halt, and you could see that. So
Yeah.
the bigger implications for the transit system are really a big deal here that you don't hear people talking about much.
Yeah. Well, so I think getting back to like my anecdotal observation as a Waymo user, and I think most folks, I mean, I guess like one, there haven't been any deaths so far, so that's sort of what you like. It's what you would expect, but we
I'm
still
saying
need to
that's table
see
stakes. For the first
table
10 million miles,
stakes.
no deaths is basically table stakes. Because there's
Got it.
just, if you have a fatality in the first 10 million miles, then you
Well,
have a
they're
huge,
above 10 million miles now,
they,
right?
they are,
So,
they are, but who else is, right?
yeah,
But you have a huge hole to dig out of if you have an early
gotcha.
severe injury or
Yeah,
fatality.
so in that first
Waymo's
10
made it
million
past that, and
miles,
good for them. They've
yeah.
historically been pretty measured and pretty careful about, well, they'll expand a little and they'll see some loose ends and then they'll clean them up before they push again. And other companies have notably not behaved that way.
Hmm.
So good for
What
Waymo for behaving that way.
Yeah. What about freeway miles? How does that impact safety? Because obviously Waymo doesn't operate on freeways and you drive a lot farther and faster on
Well,
freeways.
well, they're going to airports, right?
Waymo's
They're
not on freeways yet.
well,
They'll go
they're
to
talking.
airports, but they don't, I mean, they're
That's
testing
fair.
on
But
freeways and
they're talking about freeways any day now. So I don't know. By the time people listen, I don't know if they'll be on freeways or not. But that's certainly
well,
in
this will be
play.
publishing next week. So if they're on
Okay,
freeways next week, I'll be very impressed.
okay. We'll see. They're certainly trying to go that way. So we can
Yeah.
talk about it hypothetically.
But I
But
guess the impact on safety is what I'm
yeah,
more
so I
curious
have to
about,
talk.
right? Because I think at higher speeds, I'm guessing there's a correlation, more people die at higher speeds when there's an accident. But I'm guessing per mile, there's probably fewer accidents on the freeway than on city streets. That's my
The
guess.
Yeah, what you see is the Vision Zero folks, which some of the folks at Waymo really believe in, and that's
Hmm.
great. Well, if you look at that, they say under 20 miles an hour, fatality rate is quite low in a crash,
Yeah.
but above 25, 30, 35 at highway speeds, the chance of dying if you're hit is much, much, much higher. And so highway crashes tend to be less frequent, because there's less stuff to hit and it's less
Hmm.
chaotic, but they can be much more severe because of the speed. And so that sort of changes the dynamics of safety. Now, I'm sure that Waymo is extremely well aware of these kind of things, but it's a different driving environment. The consequences for a crash are much higher, and we're
Yeah.
going to see how it turns out. It's a whole different deal than going through an urban core,
Going on freeways.
going on freeways. And people who haven't thought about it as much as they should, who are in this game, say,
Hmm.
well, there's no pedestrians. Well, that's simply not true. There's pedestrians every time there's a traffic stop, every time there's
Yeah.
a broken down car. There's people crossing the highway because it's a 3 mile walk to go around to the underpass. There's people
Yeah.
on pedestrian.
Ha-
There's not a ton of them, but you
Yeah.
can't say we don't have to worry about them.
How do you think freeways should fit into an AV company's safety strategy? Do you like the approach that Waymo has taken where, they've sort of expanded, they're in a few cities and, they still haven't launched freeways or, because there is, that safety implication, right, of freeways.
It's not even just safety, it's ability to operate in a reasonable way. And so
Got it.
what all the companies are doing, including Tesla, surprise, which who said they would
Hmm.
never do it, is there's a thing called an operational design domain, which is the environment you're designed to operate in.
Got it.
And so the smart, cautious thing to do that everyone, it seems, is doing, which is a good thing, is they pick, there's a few roads, and
Hmm.
unless you're a heavy truck, because different rules or different business model. If you're a robotaxi, we're going to go on slow speed limits. We're going to avoid the craziest, nastiest, scariest intersections until we
Yeah.
get
Makes
ourselves
sense.
stable, and then we're going to gradually grow our environment. And then after we get one city down pretty well, then we'll look at the next city, and that's just the standard playbook for the whole industry. And for trucks, it's this one stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere, and now
Hmm.
we'll add another stretch of highway. So it's all the companies are doing this incremental approach
Yeah.
because safety is all about the rare events. And if you have a limited area, you get less variety in rare events.
Yeah. Well, before I like how you tease Tesla, by the way. We'll definitely get to Tesla before we get there.
Yeah.
I think more broadly around general AV safety, are there true, I guess, objective measures versus subjective? Like, I'm a Waymo user. I love the product. It's great. I've never had any issues. That's kind of more anecdotal, subjective. I like how you put it, if something happens in the first 10 million miles, that's really bad. If
Yeah.
there's a death in the first 10, I
Or
probably
if
shouldn't be
there's
laughing.
10 cars, you shouldn't be seeing a big crash with only 10 cars.
Got it.
I
So
mean,
what are
how
the
many groups of
objective
10 drivers have had a fatal crash?
So,
It's
what are some
really unusual.
objective measures that you would think about when it comes to AV safety, whether you're looking at Waymo or whether you're looking at Tesla or whether you're looking at Zoox or Cruise or any of these companies? What are some good objective measures that you can kind of, yourself look at? Maybe you don't have to rely on the companies releasing data, or maybe you do.
Well, there are a couple different categories. The first is, do they follow the industry safety standards for the technology?
Hmm.
And the answer is almost none of them do,
Hmm.
which is very concerning. Would you ride in an airplane that didn't follow the aviation safety standards?
Probably not because aviation is so safe. Believe it or not, I'm a former
Well,
aerospace engineer.
they're safe because they follow the standards, Harry. That's the whole point, right? There's more to it. There's culture, there's a bunch of other things, but
Yeah.
but following standards is sort of rule one. And in the car
Hmm.
industry, there's no requirement to follow the standards, and most of the companies say they will do smart, safe engineering, but they're not actually conforming to the standards,
The
including
AV
standards
companies.
the autonomous vehicle
I mean,
companies.
I guess the trick, I'm sure their argument back would be there's no AV companies. It's a brand new industry. And, I think especially if you look at
Waymo, come on,
OEMs,
Waymo does not conform to the international safety standards for regular cars or for autonomous or robotaxis, as far as I
right?
know.
Well, I guess I'm saying, isn't that kind of a good thing, right? Because there's never been AVs. So
No,
they,
no. In 2020, there was a standard specifically for robotaxis that was issued, and they don't conform.
but
Purpose
who
purpose
issued
written.
it? AVs are a brand new thing,
Underwriters
right?
Laboratory. Underwriters Laboratory is an accredited standard development organization.
Got it. I mean,
If
I
you go
guess
to your
obviously
fridge,
I've
if you
never
go to your
heard of
fridge,
them.
there's
And
probably if you go to open your fridge and there's probably a UL sticker inside it. They've been
okay,
around
yeah,
for
I
more
think,
than
okay,
100
I
years.
guess I have heard of them. But what do they
Yeah.
know about AVs? I guess that's my question. No one's ever done it before,
They know
right?
a lot because the industry people are on the voting committee.
Okay.
It's a legit
Well,
standard. Or ISO 26262, which is written by the car
okay, so I
industry
guess
for the
that's
car industry.
one
There you go.
objective standard, right? That have
It,
they been certified
so,
by an industry group?
or did they even claim to self-certify? They don't claim that.
Hmm.
So one objective measure is, do they claim self-certification industry safety standards? And a couple of them are working on it, but none of them, and
Well,
Waymo,
I
I think,
guess, yeah, I guess it's sort of a bad example because none of the AV companies are doing it. So if I'm looking at a new AV
but
company, maybe if one does do it, maybe that's a very, that would stand out
right.
and that's
So
interesting.
so a couple have said they're going to do it, but they haven't done it yet, so we don't get them credit yet.
Hmm.
But it's good for them. But as an industry, that's the first question. It's like, wait a minute, nobody has time to do safety standards in too much of a hurry. That sort of sets up the whole industry for it's very reasonable to question safety. If you're not
Got it.
following your safety standards, why should we believe you're safe? The next one is the companies are saying, well, we're going to count up how many injuries and fatalities and say we have fewer injuries and eventually be able to say fewer fatalities if we're being rigorous about it.
Hmm.
And that's sort of how it turned out instead of, by the way, you have to let them operate for billions of miles before you find out how that turns out. And if it turns out they weren't safe, that whole time they weren't safe, right? But but that's the environment we live in.
Yeah.
In Europe, you have to prove you're safe before you go on the road. In the US, for all cars, there's no requirement to do that. You can just put something on the road and claim you're safe, and then if there's crashes, NHTSA takes a look, right?
Got
That's
it.
how it works. So Waymo's producing numbers. The other car companies don't have enough miles to say much about numbers,
Hmm.
so you can see how those turn out. But there's a huge problem with that, and that is that what we learned in San Francisco is safety is more than how many fatalities per mile.
Yeah.
So, as an example, if you block a firehouse entrance, like you disable your car in a firehouse entrance and block the fire trucks,
Yeah.
that's a safety issue. That has nothing to do with how many people you hit with a robotaxi, right?
Yeah.
Nothing at all. And so, what we found out in San Francisco is when you take the drivers in a regular car have a lot of safety responsibilities that go beyond not hitting things.
Hmm.
They have to yield to fire equipment. They're not allowed to run red lights or run stop signs. And I know people are imperfect and they do it. Okay.
Hmm.
But they're not supposed to. And so if you have a human driver who runs every red light, would you call that human driver safe?
No.
Probably not. If you have a robotaxi that runs every red light, would you call that robotaxi safe even though it never ever had an at-fault crash?
No.
That's asking a lot to call it safe, right? So safety
Right.
is more than the number of injuries and fatalities. And none of the companies want to talk about that.
Gotcha. So what would be a good example of that beyond injuries and fatalities? Is it blocking emergency responder
Well,
vehicles, or what are some examples of that?
so there's some example rules I've come up with what safety is. There's first of all, net statistical risk has to be no worse than a human driver. Okay,
Hmm.
but that's table stakes, right? But the next one is you're not allowed to break the law in an egregious way. Now, I know everyone breaks the law a little bit and the police have
Hmm.
discretion. A tree falls down in the lane in front of you. Yes, you go
Well,
around
I
them. There's
guess
no
I guess
oncoming traffic.
technically you
I
say a
get
little
that.
bit, but
Right.
if you go over 65 miles per hour on the freeway in LA, that's technically against the law, isn't it?
Yeah, well, and so
So there's probably, hundreds
there's
of
norms,
thousands of, yeah,
there's norms
it's
and there's enforcement. So I'm not
yeah.
saying you have to rigorously obey the law, but where I'm going is if you break the law and you cause an injury or fatality,
Hmm.
okay, that's negligence, and that's a whole different thing. And
Got
the
it.
thing about negligence is that it's on a per incident basis. So I'm going to give you a complete hypothetical. This
Hmm.
completely hypothetical. Let's say I go a billion miles, so that's at least 10 times as safe as a normal human driver, and I don't kill anyone.
Yeah.
And then tomorrow, hypothetically, I'm in a hurry, so I blow through a red light because I'm in a hurry and I kill someone. And I tell the judge, well, Your Honor, I've got a billion miles without killing someone. I should get a free kill.
Hmm.
It doesn't work that way, you
Yeah.
know? But if a robotaxi company says, well, we ran through a stop sign and killed someone, but we haven't killed anyone in a billion miles, so we should get a free kill, why should that be treated any differently?
Yeah.
And the reason I give that example is I'm not saying a robotaxi company would do that. That's not the point.
Hmm.
The point is, even if you have statistically superior outcomes, you have an additional requirement that you're not allowed to drive recklessly.
Okay.
You're
I
just not
like
allowed
that.
to, right?
Yeah.
And so
I
one of
think
it
the
is obeying the law.
key kind of point is, yeah, if there's negligent, I mean, I guess, the term, right, auto accident, right, that people say it's an
Yeah, it's a
accident, but I
mishap.
mean,
It's a mishap. It's a loss event. It's not an accident. There are no
yeah,
accidents.
a lot. Well, I guess that's my point. A lot of times
Go
it
talk
is
to
an
Jesse Singer. There's
accident,
no
right?
accident. There are no
Eh,
accidents.
If people are
But
being negligent. So it's sort of your safety record plus the negligence
Yeah.
side of
You're
things.
not allowed to be a negligence. I'm not a lawyer, but I've co-authored. I have 3 law journal papers, which is 3 more than I ever thought I'd have. But
Three
because
more
I
than me.
co-authored with a really cool lawyer at Miami, and so if you violate a law and it leads to a result, that is called negligence per se. It is presumed negligence, right?
Mm,
And so negligence matters. Now, in safety standards, they don't talk about negligence and liability.
got it.
Why? Because that's a human driver's problem. Well, guess what?
Hmm.
There's no human driver. So
Yeah.
now it's the robotaxi problem. So you have to worry about liability and negligence and breaking the law there in a way that is reckless. Let's just say that and not get into the speed limits and all that. If you're at some point, if you're reckless, it's a problem. There's also what if I'll give you another hypothetical. Okay.
Hmm.
What if the number of fatalities went from 40,000 to 20,000 because every single car was in a robotaxi in the whole US? That's going to be decades. But let's say
Yeah.
you're there and it goes from 40,000 to 20,000 or 10,000.
Hmm.
And every single one is a pedestrian. No occupant ever dies, but the number of pedestrian fatalities goes up by a factor of 2 or 3 or 4.
Hmm.
How are pedestrians going to feel about safety?
Not great.
They're not going to be happy.
Yeah.
And so it turns out that another rule is for society to accept you're safe, not safety engineers who like loss metrics per
Hmm.
mile, but for society to consider you safe, you cannot transfer risk
Yeah.
for the benefit of the people in the car, but it puts other people who are considered vulnerable at increased risk. That's not gonna work. You can't do
Yeah.
that.
Well, I guess that's kind of what's so tricky because obviously the kind of layman or the average person isn't going to be able to go down the rabbit hole of, okay, 40,000, 10,000, good, but who are the 10,000 that are now dying? How does that
And that
compare to the
and
old,
that's really tricky.
yeah.
Yeah. So I have 2 more points here. All right. There's
Okay,
actually a
keep
longer
going.
list. There's a longer list. I'm not going to do the whole list, but if anyone
I
watches
think
my
this was one
YouTube,
of your blog posts, so we can leave a
yeah,
link at
uh,
show notes.
I have a YouTube video where I spend an hour going down this list.
Ah, even
I'm,
better.
I'm going to
Okay.
sort of
So
bail
if they
on
want
that.
more Phil,
Yeah,
if they can't
more
get
fill
enough
than
after
they
this episode.
more than they can stand. I
All
meant.
right.
All right. So where does this end up? Where this ends up is that safety is not just statistically better than the human driver, but there are a bunch of things you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to block fire trucks
Yeah.
because you're not allowed to say, well, our engineers are so smart, they know that fire truck, that guy probably won't die, so it's okay to block him. Come on. You're not, you're just not allowed to do that. And again, people aren't perfect and maybe the car's
Yeah.
broken and I get that, but you're not allowed to say it's okay to block this guy because reasons. It's like, you're just
Hmm.
not supposed to do it. Right. But where this ends up is people incorrectly say, well, robotaxis, it's unfair because robotaxis have to be 100 times safer for people to trust them. And I've seen
Hmm.
studies that say that. But I take a much more nuanced view. I don't think they have to be safer than people, but they look at it the wrong way. It's not a statistical statement. It's a per mishap statement. Okay. So if robotaxis have the same statistics and they don't drive recklessly and they don't do a lot of other things, they probably are going to end up better than people in general. But even if they don't, I think that the way people react to bad news is they don't know statistics that well. I mean, how
Hmm.
many how many people have a grad degree in statistics, right? It's not
Yeah.
everyone in machine learning ends up there, but that's not a normal skill. That's not a
Right.
usual skill. And people reason poorly about statistics. Look at how lottery tickets work, right?
Hmm.
People expected values less than one for the money you put in, but it's real. The distribution is really lumpy, and if you get lucky,
Yeah.
it really makes your life, right? Or not. That's a whole different deal. But people don't normally think of statistics. People think in stories.
Hmm.
And so some of the bad reputation you've seen the robotaxi companies get, they'll say, well, we have these impressive statistics. Why do people not trust us that much?
Yeah.
And there's studies showing the trust is low. And it's because people don't think in statistics, they think in stories. And
Hmm.
so they read a news story about that poor woman getting dragged down the street by a cruise, and that's what sticks in their mind, not
Yeah.
the cruise claims they made the day before that about X number of times safer and all these metrics. But they dragged that poor woman down the street, and
Hmm.
that was a problem. So I'm an engineer. I'm not a psychologist. So
Yeah.
I'm gonna have my own personal theory, and you can make of it what you will. But I think the reputation of the industry is going to be made or broken on a crash by crash basis. And every crash, people will judge the safety based on whether they themselves would have made that mistake.
Got it.
Okay. Now that's a really tough
Well, that's a
standard
tough
because
standard because, like you said, there's going to be a lot of, kind of common sense situations that maybe AVs aren't so
well,
great at.
if they're bad at so lack of common sense is the Achilles heel for this technology for that reason, because that's the
Yeah.
criteria, I think. But it's worse because, and it's not, I'm not going to say it's fair, and I'm not trying to hold anyone to that
Yeah.
standard. I'm just telling you this is how the world works. Deal with it, to be
Yeah.
clear. All right. I'm not trying to impose, it's not Phil trying to do this standard. It's like I'm just observing how the world
Well,
works. So I
I think
bring
why
you
this
bad news,
topic is so interesting is because it is the intersection of, the safety engineering, the public perception, the
Right.
company's
And,
reputation, right? Regulators. It isn't as simple as, oh, hey, we're safer than the
right.
average human driver. There's a lot, like you said, I like
There's
that
more.
crash by crash,
And by the way, there's
terminology.
no human to blame because
Yeah.
the whole point was there's no human. But here's what's tough about it. The first one is I actually tracked down the study because I've heard it, but I tracked down a
Hmm.
study that showed 80% of drivers think they're above average. So that sets the bar higher automatically,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And then you've all heard of Monday morning quarterbacking, right?
Yeah.
So someone who thinks they're above average driver, but they're not, and has the had benefit, oh, I would never have made that mistake, even
Right.
if they literally made the mistake the previous day and just didn't hit,
Yeah.
they're still going to say that, right? And
Yeah.
and it's a terrible metric to be judged by because it's so harsh. But I think that's the real world, and the
Hmm.
companies sort of have to deal with the real world.
But I guess the public perception, how much does that matter with, this is kind of getting more into, I guess the business model of the companies, right? But if I'm an AV company, do I really care what a bunch of people say if it doesn't impact my ridership, my growth, right? Because I think there's this kind of fine line between the perception that people have, but hey, if I'm actually safer, and yeah, there is going to be, one situation where maybe we, kill someone and, a human may not have done that, but on an absolute basis, hey, we're 4 times safer, 4 times less deaths. I guess I'm just trying to think about the best way to balance those two things.
Well, you can push the technology up to a point, and then people push back.
Yeah,
Uh, and the question is, how far can they push? And
got it.
if you have a reputation for having a lot of fatalities, you have a lot less margin to push, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that's the interesting takeaway I'm getting is it's kind of the type of crash that you have is
Oh,
going to matter.
the optics
Yeah,
matter, but we're back to if you say, you know, companies will want to say, well, that's the technology can't avoid that, and
right,
people who don't have deep understanding of the technology may or may not believe that, but why should they care?
right.
They're going to judge it by, well, I would never have made that mistake.
Yeah,
So if the companies only have crashes that a person could say, oh man, I could see that happening to me, they're
yeah,
going to get some sympathy. And if they have crashes that are just, are you kidding me? You did what?
yeah, you
Or
idiot.
if they have a crash, it's very simple. Just say, if a human driver did that, what would I say about them? And if I
Yeah,
would say they're unsafe, why would I not say that about a robotaxi? I
yeah,
think that's what you're going to see as a very human,
got it.
normal reaction.
So I guess if I'm a Robotaxi company and I'm, scaling and growing and I can maybe make the case that we're safer, but I mean, I guess maybe I don't want to make that case unless I'm addressing that issue, right? That like, hey, would a
Yeah.
human have done that? And you might get one, you might get two. I guess I'm trying to think of like, what is the actual risk to the company? Like if a bunch of people that never would have taken an AV company are complaining, like I kind of actually don't care about that. But if they're going to complain and then news and media are going to cover it and then regulators are going to come in, like I guess is that the risk that like regulators would take that public perception? Like what would be the action that then negatively affects the company in your mind?
Well, investors lose confidence. If you have a
Yeah,
funding,
okay, yeah, that's a
if you
good
have
point.
limited funding
Investors could lose
runway,
confidence. Yeah,
do investors want to place their chips on a company that just had a fatality? And
yep,
we've seen
yeah,
that
that's a good
companies
point.
that have severe crashes don't do well, right? They have
Yeah,
trouble with
that's a good
money.
point.
But there's also regulators. That it's going to be, if you have a really horrific crash, there's going to be big public push on the regulators to be seen to do something about it,
Yeah.
right? And so that's a big risk too.
Yeah. And so I think, I'm going to put a nail in this topic right now, but,
Yeah.
but because I like thinking about it too and mixing that safety, that public perception, and then also too, I'm a business focused person. So it's
Right.
like, I think a lot of times people get caught up, oh, this person says this. Well, what can they do to impact your business in the future? Do they actually have a path to impacting? And yeah, I think if a public push and there was a regulator who could then come in, and negatively change or affect or limit your operations, that would be challenging. So, yeah, no, I think
And
all very interesting.
it's broader than that because if one company does something really bad, there may be a
Yeah,
push for
the
regulations that
whole
affect
industry.
everyone, right?
Yeah. So I guess if I'm Waymo, I'm maybe sort of happy that it's just me right now operating and no one else is screwing things up for me. But you do have Tesla, like you mean, okay, I teased Tesla enough. Let's end on talking a little bit of Tesla.
Okay.
What are your overall sort of thoughts on, I don't know, if you want to share, sort of how you feel about Tesla, the company, or you want to just focus on their Robotaxi deployment in Austin and kind of go whichever direction you want to go.
Well, let's talk about the robotaxi deployment.
All right.
You've got full self-driving, which is not really full self-driving, right? Because there
I do
has to be someone
quotes,
paying
quote
attention,
unquote, full
quote
self-driving.
unquote, full self-driving. Now they put a supervised at the end. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
And they, it's hard to know what to think because there's so little information, so much speculation. The company's
Yeah.
being pretty closed-lip about it. But
And everyone
based
wants
on
to know. So it's tough because
everyone's there.
everyone's asking about it, but there's so little
So,
info and so much speculation.
so I'm happy to speculate as long as you know it's speculation
Okay.
based on stuff I know what I think the likely outcome is. But of course, I could
Yeah.
be wrong. I think the likely outcome is they will have spent effort making FSD better behaved in Austin.
Hmm.
For example, maybe they put a bunch of Austin specific training data into Dojo and
Yeah.
have a variant, either regular FSD knows more about Austin, or they put a different for if I were them, I'd have a different flavor of FSD that's trained more on Austin than the normal version.
Yeah.
Why not? Why not?
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that,
I
right?
mean, that's
Well,
similar to what other AV companies do. They map a new city or they, kind
yeah,
of,
right. It's not quite mapping the new city, but although
yeah.
who knows if they have
But
maps
I
or
think it's
whatever.
the same concept, right? You want some, if there's going to be evergreen data about a
Yeah,
place that you're going to be doing a lot of rides in, why
yeah.
wouldn't you add that to your
So,
model?
so load up the end-to-end machine learning with a higher percentage of Austin data than you
Yeah.
would otherwise, not entirely, but higher percentage.
Hmm.
And that's not cheating. That's just
Yeah.
being smart about
I
deploying
think
and
that's a
learning.
good thing.
It's a good thing. It's a good thing.
Yeah.
So I expect they'll do that, but I just don't see their technology and have some insight into how it works
Hmm.
and all that. I just don't see it being something you can just turn loose on the streets and be smart enough to know when to ask for help. I think it's going to need someone keeping an eye on it.
Got
So
it.
I think at first, what we're going to see, well, if I'm going to assume it's a responsible deployment instead
Hmm.
of a PR stunt, right? Because Elon Musk is famously risk hungry and risk tolerant. So who
Yeah.
knows what's going to happen? But if somebody said, well, what's the thing they can do that moderates the risk while achieving the objective of deploying
Hmm.
because there's pressure to deploy? What are you going to see? Well, you're going to see FSD. I call it FSD remote supervised. There's
Okay.
someone with a steering wheel and a screen in an office someplace in Austin, and he's taking the place of the driver who would normally be in the driver's seat.
Got
And
it.
FSD is running. And if FSD can go 1,000 miles with no intervention, it goes 1,000 miles with no intervention. That's fine.
Hmm.
But when the moment comes that the sun glare hits it wrong, or there's something unexpected happening, or it just isn't sure what to do, the thing about FSD is it's not good at saying it needs help. It just makes the wrong decision and the person just jumped in, and if it's a human driver, you blame them for the crash, right? That's
Yeah.
the if FSD safety, you can't say, well, look how safe FSD is, therefore it's road taxis. No. FSD does what it does, and we blame the person for the crashes. But with no person, you don't get that same
So
level of safety.
I,
So I
I
think
guess,
it's just going to be a remote
yeah.
driver somewhere with a steering wheel and a screen on day
I
one.
yeah.
On day one.
I guess that could definitely happen, and that adds, that would add more safety than less. I just feel like the amount of safety that adds is very minimal because I think I shared this. I'm going to pull this up so I don't mess up the stat, but I think if I calculated this right in a recent newsletter, I said that, at 35 miles per hour, a car travels approximately 51 feet per second, and it's pretty far, 50 feet in less than a second. So half a second,
Yeah.
25 feet, a quarter of a second. I mean, obviously, even with the best latency on a remote teleoperated, if something quickly comes into vision, it's going to take a little bit of
Well,
time. So I just feel like if something does serious, like I don't think a remote operator really adds much safety wise.
well, it depends how you design the system. So for this
Hmm.
to work, it has to be very, very fast, as you correctly point out. But down at a hundredth of a second, people can only react so fast. So if you have dense, dedicated
Yeah.
bandwidth on a 5G system, and you have specially designed, you're not using a PlayStation controller, you're using something
Hmm.
serious, you can get the response time low enough to mostly drive okay at slow speeds. Vey, for example, is remotely driving in
Right.
Vegas.
Yeah,
Okay.
I've been to Vay's office in Vegas, and
Yeah.
I've ridden in one of their cars,
So,
and I guess on my one
so
trip worked out pretty well.
but you can do it, and it mostly works. And the
Yeah,
question is, does it work enough? And what happens when the coverage drops out?
right.
At 10 miles an hour, you jam on the brakes and probably it's fine, right?
Yeah, you're right. Slow
But at
speeds.
25, maybe not so much. Or but the issue is if you have latency or dropout just when you needed to jump in to save the day,
Right.
maybe turning on the brakes doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
So there's a difference between driving and a driver knowing something's going wrong when I hit the brakes
Hmm.
and intervening and everything going south just as the connection drops.
Yeah.
That sounds a lot riskier to me.
So I guess you envision, so I guess this in tandem with, a very limited operational domain, right? If it's only on certain big streets and then, okay, it can go off on the little side streets at 10,
Yeah.
15 miles an hour. That's pretty
And,
safe. I feel like a very limited domain with, I don't know, I'm still not, I guess
and
I
10
would,
cars. Don't forget, maybe
yeah,
10
10
cars.
cars. Yeah.
One in a billion doesn't happen to 10 cars.
Yeah. So if they have 10 cars and then they've got a remote operator kind of watching over each
Yeah.
car, then yeah, it
I,
adds
I'm not going to say I'm a
some
super
safety.
fan of it for safety,
Yeah.
but it's something you could pull off if you're very careful to detail. Now China, this is how
Yeah.
China robotaxis have
I mean,
worked
I
for
guess
years.
like, yeah, are you okay with this type of deployment? Like if they do, like that seems, I mean,
I don't
seems
I don't know
safety
because
is so subjective, right? So it's like, it seems safe to me if that's what they did.
well, actually, it's not subjective. It's that the companies don't want to follow the objective way to safety.
Got it.
If they'd followed ISO 26262 and ISO 21448 and NCUL 4600, they could be objectively safe by conforming to industry safety standards. But if they don't, then they're
Hmm.
using engineering judgment, and I have no idea how it's going to turn out. We're going to have to
Yeah.
see.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, we chatted Tesla. Anything else on Tesla's potential robotaxi launch in Austin?
Well, the question is going to be, sure, they can run a handful of cars for a few days and claim
Yeah.
victory. And even if they're 10x more dangerous than a human driver, with 10 cars for a couple days, probably
Nothing
nothing will
should
happen
happen.
anyway.
If something, I
Yeah.
guess, again, I'm gonna learn from you. If something does happen, that's really,
And
really
that's
bad.
super bad, right? Yeah. So
Yeah.
the expectation is they should be able to run a dozen cars for the rest of the year and nothing should happen at all
Yeah.
because the odds are in their favor. Okay. Now,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that that justifies doing it sloppily. It doesn't,
Hmm.
but they may decide to take a bigger risk than people would be comfortable if they knew the risk they were taking or not. I don't know, but they could decide to take that risk and probably they'd get lucky
Yeah.
and it would help their stock price and all that other stuff. But the big problem for Tesla, as for Waymo, as for everyone, is what happens when you add more cars, because the stuff that was never going to happen starts happening, and
Yeah.
that's where safety gets much, much harder.
Cool. Well, I kind of want to end on a note here. Any final advice for Elon and Tesla or more broadly AV companies out there? If you sort of had, a quick couple minutes where you could kind of, tell them one quick thing, what would you tell them?
Getting lucky doesn't scale. Just because you got lucky for a few miles doesn't mean you're always going to be lucky, right?
Yeah.
And so if you see someone without a crash, it could be
Hmm.
because they've done their homework and they're legitimately safe. Maybe they're following the safety standards and they just don't want to tell anyone. Who knows, right? So if you see someone without a crash, the question the public needs to ask is that because they're lucky or is that because they really did the homework and did the
Yeah.
work and they're safe? And there's really no way to tell unless they tell us why we should believe they're safe.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's a great note to end on, Phil. I really appreciate you coming on and sharing all of your 30 years of experience in the AV industry. And, I know you mentioned you're transitioning into retiring, but I feel like we're still going to see a lot and hear a lot from you over on your Substack, philkoopman.substack.com. We'll leave a link to that in the show notes. I think you might have referenced one or two blog posts too that we can also put up. And if folks want to find you or follow you, we've got your LinkedIn. Anything else that they should know?
Well, I'm not entirely vanishing. I'm just sort of shifting gears into
Well,
a
when people say
post-university
they're
career.
gonna retire, but if they're doing something that they really love, I feel like,
Uh,
they aren't going too far.
Yeah, I'm not vanishing. I'm just changing gears. So thanks for having me on here. I really
All right,
appreciate it.
Phil, that was fun. Thanks.